Good evening and welcome to all, and many thanks to our speakers for accepting our initiative. I'm Luciano La Rivera, an Italian Jesuit and Secretary for European Affairs of JESC, the Jesuit European Center in Brussels. The JESC implements its own initiative, but especially partnership to promote the Christian values in Europe, and particularly on social justice and ecology, and by training in leadership service, the new generation.
So you have to mute yourself, please.
Yes. Yes, I do both also.
It's very challenging, so
no, don't worry. And an important initiative of a project of JESC is the ELP program, the European Leadership Program, to train in leadership service young generation. JESC is promoting this meeting that is organized by Passion for Europe. Passion for Europe is a group of Christians of different nationalities and confessions involved in EU activities. It was formed as a place to exchange on Europe's future, based on Pope Francis' vision for Europe and the social teaching of the Church. This group, with the support of Father Martin Mayer, a Jesuit, whom I replaced at JESC last July, was formed in 2016 to reflect on the European values at stake with the immigration crisis. Prior to COVID, Passion for Europe organized conferences at the Chapel for Europe and in collaboration with the Chapel for Europe, which also support us in this initiative. I also thank the Centro Culturale Veritas in Trieste, which I still direct, for their help. The theme of this conference, European Democracy in a Time of Confusion, launches the reflection and dialogue that awaits us at La Perelle. In that Jesuit Spirituality Center in Namur, we will hold our 4th residential seminar from the 16th to the 18th of September. And so we invite you to take part in it. I show you 2 images of these places at our meeting. Simply. This is our group last year. The theme last year was Which Common Home, Borders and Bridges After the Crisis. This is our website with the title of the new event in September. We will shortly publish the program on the Passion for Europe website, where the registration form is already available. As in the previous edition, intergeneration dialogue will be crucial, especially with ELP alumni. Only a note, you can write your ideas and suggestions and questions on the chat, also before the debate. And then when we start the debate, we can raise your digital arm or simply to send a message on the chat, and we will give you the floor. And finally, I present you Henning Vostein, who moderates our meeting. Henning is a member of Passion for Europe group. He's the founder and the executive partner of Autumn Public Affairs. He's also a member of the Public Policy Commission of the UTech, European Technology Chamber. So the floor is yours, Henning.
Thank you so much, Luciano. And I have been participating at La Perelle already 3 times now. And last year it was, let's say, a very impressive meeting because we had, after COVID, the first physical meeting again with so many young people over there. And one thing was astonishing for us that they stick pretty much about their nationality. still, and identity issues are still very deeply rooted in also the next generation, the new generation, Erasmus generation in the European Union. So we have been working on searching for the title of this year's La Perelle, and we are still in progress there, but we have chosen the title European Democracy in Time of Confusion because of two things. Because over the years, since 2015, our group has been pretty much working on the transnational, the post-national aspects of democracy in the EU, and combined with confusion, because during that time multiple crises have been coming up. Just after the banking crisis, we were in the midst of a migration crisis. I think the migration crisis actually has driven aspects of it. We have seen Brexit in the year after. COVID came in. War is back on the European shores, which is unbelievable for us all. But the overarching thing for us to see also is technology. Technology is a, let's say, sort of a crisis, because having influence on so many aspects of our society. Our discussions has been around, as Luciano said, about communities. So after two tremendous wars last century, the founding fathers were coming from broader communities, and these broader communities were during the crisis I just have named also all the time the discussion and the part of our reflections. Border communities and their role in, let's say, designing the future of the European Union in a diversity and in a different cultures we coming from, in intergenerational differences. So let's say there are two aspects in that title, European Democracy in Time of Confusion. There might be that aspect of the encyclical letter Fratelli Tutti, let's say how to build up a community. And I think European Union has to guide and be an example there. And confusion, perhaps these aspects of the encyclical letter Laudato Si, because it is about making the right decisions when it comes also to this aspect of climate change and saving the common good. So this webinar today is about, let's say, having you with us to design this further on our way to the next La Perelle. So we thought inviting a philosopher would be a very good thing. Tineke Beekman is a Belgian philosopher, has been in an academic career at the Vrije Universiteit in Brussels, has its PhD title since 2003, and is a lecturer and columnist since 10 years time, and writing and discussing about Freud, Nietzsche, Machiavelli, and Heidegger. Tineke will start afterwards with a short introductory remark, but I also have the pleasure to present Paul F. Nemitz to you. Paul F. Nemitz is a lawyer at the University of Hamburg. He holds a master in comparative law from George University, a law school in Washington, and he is a long-time official of the European Commission, has experience in different directorate generals, has been member of cabinets of commissioners, and now today is a principal advisor in the Director General for Justice and Consumers of the European Commission. Hello, Paul. Glad to have you with us. A huge pleasure to present to you Paolo Benanti, who is a professor at the Georgian Pontifical University in Rome. And Paolo Benanti has been publishing on pretty much about artificial intelligence and ethics. So watching on the ethics aspects of new technologies. Professor Benanti, buonasera. And at the end of our debate, we will having Kamil Mikulski, who is a PhD student at the Rey Juan Carlos University in Spain, and will bring out what your dialogue and your discussions have been produced as a member of let's say the next generation, the Erasmus generation of that European Union. He is working on hybrid threats and disinformation, and is, by the way, also member of the European Commission's experts group on tackling disinformation. So I have been talking a lot. Tineke, the floor is yours. Please give us your view on how to, let's say, enrich the title of our next La Perelle conference.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. And in my short talk right now, I will focus on the fact that technological inventions that drive today's society, also in a political sense, that they are potentially politically divisive. I'm talking about the internet and social media. In itself, I think that these technologies can also be constructive, and I'm sure that we're going to talk about that later on, the fascinating possibilities of technology. And I'm not against technology as such, but here now I'm going to focus on some of the divisive aspects. I think they are divisive in the sense that they contain mechanisms that do not help to bring citizens together in a kind of public sphere. And here what I'm saying now is really also inspired by Hannah Arendt and her political philosophy. What you need in a democracy is an open public space, a space where citizens can come together and act in plurality. And on the other hand, you also need a private sphere that is closed off, that is intimate, where you can meet loved ones and so on. And for Hannah Arendt, it's the experience of totalitarianism that made her emphasize this distinction, because in totalitarianism, you do not have a private life. You have ideological parties who intervene and who leave you no room for yourself. They structure your whole life, also your private life. There are many descriptions of that also in literature. You have Bulgakov, the Master, Margarita, Solzhenitsyn, Orwell. They all perfectly describe the disaster if you don't have a private life, if politics intervenes too much. And I think now that's part of what I'm going to try to say. I think there is a movement in the other direction. I think that the private has too much of an emphasis on the public. Yeah? And I will try to talk about the role of technology in that evolution. But first, I'd like to look at how democracies worked in a sense. So after the Second World War, where you have political institutions in Belgium, France, Germany, and so on, the Netherlands, Italy, and so on, that came into existence in the 19th century. And what is specific about the 19th century is that parliamentary democracy coincides with the boundaries of the nation state, and that it's the nation state is also the territory that connects citizens, interest groups, the market, and politics. See that very clearly in Belgium and in other countries. And so in the parliament, nationally, laws are voted that define the relations between citizens, interest groups, and the economic market. And so you have a sense of community, you have a sense that everybody plays a certain role in that political constellation, and it is driven by the technological evolution of industrialization. And I think that continues to be the case until after the Second World War. Then you have the European Union. It starts to develop as a post-national and transnational project. And the EU itself, of course, evolved from an economic collaboration to a more political union with a single currency. And that, of course, has changed both democracies and the nation state, and also has raised questions about that European Union, because many political issues need to be discussed on the level of the European Union. So you need to build a sense of community there too. And for instance, how to regulate multinationals like Google or Facebook. Nation states are powerless. And I think a lot of citizens also know that. So that's a big plus, I think, for a great opportunity for the European Union, the fact that it is a very important political level. And also, on the other hand, a lot of the politics of the nation states are implementations of regulations that are given by the European Union. So I think there's a double question. How can we address the attack on the European Union from nationalistic politicians and the divisions that they create on the one hand, and how can we create a democratic public sphere within the European Union? Now maybe a bit more about the political effects of these new technologies, social media and the internet, on parliamentary democracies, and what does it also mean for the cohesion of the European Union? And as I said, the democracy requires the distinction between the public and the private, between the role of the citizen in a plurality, in a changing world, and the more hidden, intimate, personal space where politics does not intervene. And I think internet has changed both the public and the private sphere. First of all, the public sphere is where citizens come together, discuss and act. And that can be in real life. And today that can also be virtually. And when it is virtually, like we are having a virtual public space, if you like, there are many possibilities. However, that virtual public space is partially in the hands of private companies who impose their own rules and systems and who seek profit, which is a main factor, I think, in a lot of the problems we face today. Now, to some extent, that public sphere was always influenced by private companies before. You had newspapers, you had the media, and so on. But the difference is, first of all, that citizens have the feeling that they can express themselves. They deliver the content that is being distributed. That's a big difference. And secondly, what's the dynamic of distribution? Who gets to see or to hear what? And that is determined by, for instance, algorithms. And the goal of the algorithms and the whole dynamic of these internet companies is profit. And the goal is not how can we create a democratic public sphere. And that's a very important element, because also for newspapers, you see that journalists and journalism saw itself as playing a certain role, the so-called fourth power that's critical of power politics, etc. That's a kind of intermediary between citizens. Here you have companies who simply do not consider the public role they play. They have a goal of their own. And first, like Facebook and Instagram and so on, first and foremost, they want to keep users attached to their machine as long as possible. So if users are tempted by dynamic that undermine an open discussion in the public sphere. For instance, there's a strong prevalence of negative emotions in the spreading of information, simply because that attracts a lot of clicks and likes, and it generates a lot of connections. But of course, if you have an overwhelming amount of information that makes you angry or emotional and so on, that leads more to distrust. You do not have a connection that necessarily is constructive, or that is an exchange of information that leads to a kind of trust. And trust, as Alexis de Tocqueville said it already in the 19th century, is crucial for a democracy. You have to believe that the information other people bring to the public sphere is trustworthy, because reality is so complex that you by yourself cannot check or know everything. So everybody, there's a kind of trust that all the contributions of the citizens is willingly, and not is not focusing on any kind of negativity or disinformation. Secondly, social media has made private sphere more relevant. People can withdraw in their virtual world, which they often prefer over the real world. If you talk to young people, I'm generalizing, of course, but if you talk to young people, very often it's the case. They kind of disengage from the outside world, from groups and from other citizens. Added to that, social media offer your own profile where you can distribute private information. You can virtually create a self. You can look for the self. Who are you? You find with younger generations very much also a need to define themselves, to look for that self, for who they are, as an inward thing to do. And I think technology allows for that idea of focusing very much on the self. Another aspect is also, I think, that people expect the outside world to be equally comfortable and recognizable as the private world. And for instance, the idea of safe spaces, that for young people, not for all of them, but for some young people is very important. I think it's also connected to that, the sense that if you go outside, you want to be comfortable, you want to hear views that you can recognize, you don't want to be offended, you don't want to be unpleasantly surprised. And that is something that I think is linked to the fact that they experience technology so profoundly, and that for them it is so self-evidently a part of their life. I also think, for instance, that the fact that a lot of young people experience bullying on the internet, through the internet, also plays a role in that. So I think technology has changed a lot of experiencing reality, and I think all these phenomena do not have to be underestimated. And we are at a point where we have to still do a lot of research on the effect of social media and internet on the lives, especially of young people. The difference is also that the differences in worlds, in people, in beliefs, etc., that you encounter on the internet, it's not the same as plurality in reality. It's not the same with the idea of plurality that, for instance, Hannah Arendt had in her idea of democracy. First of all, because you are in contact with some people and not with others. There are the algorithms, you can choose, you can block, you can. It becomes possible to live in a world where you decide what kind of difference you encounter and what kind of difference you want to see. And you see it also with disinformation, that people are in a kind of bubble. They're in their own bubble and they can create a world of their own that is very much linked to a virtual reality where they're not being contradicted, or where they don't hear views that they disagree with or that confront their own views. So these are a few ideas about that relation between the private and the public. What I also want to say is that new technologies, and now it's more focused on European Union, they seem also to serve strongmen. I know it's more complicated than this, but I just briefly want to give a few ideas. So strongmen both within the European Union and outside of it. And I think social media have helped the spreading of authoritarian ideas of leadership. Because of the way that it is constructed, it's easier for strongmen to present themselves. First of all, because they can falsely claim that reality is simple. It's not complicated, it's simple. We saw that with Brexit, with Nigel Farage. Don't believe the media who say it is sophisticated. This is just a simple question. Secondly, the very personalized presentation of politicians also feeds the illusion that one person can solve everything. Thirdly, there are companies like Cambridge Analytica who, because of the information that they have, or the data that they have on users of social media, can target voters in a very specific way. So again, this helps people who have these very simplistic and very radical political ideas to sell their message. Also, discussions based on facts can be avoided, or facts can even actively and cynically be dismissed with false information. There's a lot of cynicism, I think, also by these strong men, these ideologues, these people who do not have any democratic intentions in the way they present themselves. The strongmen also get more the opportunity to divide the world in morally commendable people or reprehensible people. That's the very polarizing effect. You have the dutiful followers, like the followers on Twitter, and then you have those people who disagree, who become enemies, who need to be defeated. So plurality is not accepted, and I think technology helps in a sense to present a view of leadership that does not allow for plurality. And then lastly, these strongmen also directly challenge the European Union. They have a tendency to glorify the past of the nation state, a nostalgia for the past. And they seem to present a kind of protection against the influence of institutions or international organizations. Lastly, maybe shortly also, what to do. I was asked also to say something about what to do, which as a philosopher, I always find a very difficult part of the talk. But I think we need to encourage real physical encounters because they create trust. Trust is in a sense, a physical thing. And Michael Ignatieff, the Canadian philosopher, politician who wrote a book about philosophy and politics, describes that beautifully, you know, the importance of real physical encounters to create trust and bonds. And I think also that they have a very positive effect on the social life, but also on the inner life of people. Because that's another chapter, I won't talk about that right now, but one of the effects of that social media is that people often feel lonely and that they don't feel their needs for human contact are often not being met. So I think it's very important to focus on these real physical encounters. Secondly, also focus on what unites people. There are plenty of things that unite people and not what is divisive. I think also that the use of social media should be critically analyzed, and their schools or other organizations can help navigate young people and help see the downsides of these influences of technology when they are being negative. And lastly, I think we have to further develop these actions against the political consequences of social media and the internet on the international level. On the European Union has the possibility, I think, to make these companies take more responsibility for the damaging effects that they have. And I think that's also a very important path to follow. So I think I will leave it at this as a
Thank you so much,
opening
Ineke. It
remark.
was, as you said, physical encounters. We almost haven't done the last part Laplerelle last year because of COVID, and we were thinking, is it good? We did it, and it was a great experience. I can only underline this. Paul, I think a few, or in the hands of a few companies, and the profit side of the discussion, social media gives you loads of ideas to come in. So Paul, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation, first of all, and it's a great pleasure to be here among people who commit to their values. I think that is important, and that's also the reason why I came. I'm not a Catholic. I'm a Protestant, but not very religious. I believe in the earthly work of the church, actually, and happy to discuss about that on occasion. But I think I could undersign everything Tineke has said, and I have written also many of those things she said in my book. But I would like to approach the theme a little bit from a different angle. Namely, if we go back in history and think about the times of confusion in democracy, we have to remember that the disinformation issue in this about which we discussed today as a phenomenon of the internet is actually something which, in particular in Europe, is not new. In the 1968 student revolution, the students in Berlin were going down the streets demonstrating against the biggest tabloid in Germany, the Bild Zeitung, with the slogan "Bild lies." And of course, in the times of the Cold War, we had huge disinformation attempts from Russia and the communist bloc. And we, on the other hand, had also Radio Free Europe, which was paid by the US government to send their vision of the world, in particular to Eastern Europe. So I think not everything in the world of the internet is new, but what has happened since those times, since the 1968s, where not only the students were very political, but the parties were very big. You know, Willy Brandt made many people join social democracy. I think also the churches were much fuller than today. What has happened since then, I would say, is a certain complacency about democracy. First, a complacency of engagement in the West, both in Europe and in the United States, all carriers of values, of other values than just making money and you know, being great in capitalism and on the market, all the carriers of other values then the market values have lost out. It's not only that there are much less people going to church and are being actually members and active members of churches. It's also the case that there are much fewer people members of parties. Some democratic important parties have completely disappeared. Let's say in France, the Socialist Party has completely disappeared. The unions have become much weaker. So I would say all of this has not been compensated by the new type of movements, even let's say the recent movements like Pulse of Europe or Fridays for Future. I don't think that these movements are as strong and in particular as sustainable, namely over decades, as the classic political movements were. And I also think they don't reach as deep into the democratic decision-making as the classic political structures are used to reach. So we have, and we have to ask ourselves the question, why is that so? Why is there this decrease of willingness of people to engage for values? And I think we have to talk about, if you ask me, about a new ethics of engagement, a new ethics of values. And for me, to be also very clear on this, to make it very simple, I would say we have to tell our people, we have to tell our school children and our students that it is a good life if they engage in one structure, which is something beyond them as an individual, that they join up to practice collective decision-making, discussing with others, as Tineke said, also physically in presence. And this can be the church, this can be unions, this can be a big NGO, this can be a political party. But one of those, I think, should be a part of the new ethics, that we make it clear to people that individualism alone makes you lonely and is not a good life. And it also weakens the essential pillar, which is now, which is structuring our life, namely democracy, and which is under attack by a war, by an absolutist state, namely Russia and its President Putin, who stands for absolutism and corruption. And let me also be very clear. I think complacency was not only an issue of citizens in democracies, it has also been a problem of governments themselves. What do I mean by this? I think we have all realized that the practice of saying, well, you know, yes, Russia, Putin, yes, he is an autocrat, but, you know, it's a big country and we have to have good relations with them. It was a mistake. It was probably also a mistake how we related to China, often putting economic interest before the interest to talk about democracy and fundamental rights. And probably also in the European Union, we have to be honest, we started very, very late with actions against the Hungarian government of Viktor Orban and actions against the Polish reign of PiS. Both of these have been able to basically disable the mechanisms of democracy. And the key mechanism of democracy is that the way must be open for change. Both of them have been able to dismantle the checks and balances. Tineke talked about the fourth estate, the free journalism, which criticizes power, but also free academia, a vibrant civil society. So checks and balances, not only by EU law, but also other mechanisms of checks and balances have been step by step dismantled, while we watched on and said, well, you know, hey, let's have another nice word with them. And so for me, the lesson here is that we must come back to some of the hard findings in the Cold War. Because in the Cold War, it was clear that the communist bloc tried to undermine Western democracies with a lot of money, spent with communist parties financed from Moscow in the West. And we even learned that many of the terrorist movements went to holiday behind the Iron Curtain. And in this time, the sentence of the democracy which defends itself was born. This was, for example, this was a sentence of Willy Brandt again, who stands for liberal democracy. But the idea was that we should not be naive, that we should not be naive about the enemies of democracy and the enemies of values, and that we have to speak out clearly, and we have to develop instruments and structures to defend the functioning of democracy against these enemies. And I think today, when we talk about the confusion, I would say, you know, never let a good crisis go to waste. Now it is time to become much clearer on these things, because we are not anymore in a confusion about democracy. Democracy is under attack, and the biggest attack is the war. And so this war in Europe requires that we relearn to defend ourselves physically and militarily. We have to start to build up again the structures which were dismantled after the Cold War. The physical war has not gone away, and this is what's happening now in the European Union. But second, on the side of complacency towards autocratic movements, you know, and countries and political movements which may not be so clearly going in these directions, but which have some elements, I think we have to call and start calling a spade a spade. We have been too long, too tolerant, too well, you know, that we're all friends type of, and, you know, thinking about the economy, and in Europe also about the internal market and so on. I think we have to be much more clear. One of the biggest mistakes the Commission made in the Brexit discussions, for example, in the UK, is that it was silent. The European Parliament and the European Commission as institutions defending European values were silent when in the UK campaign on Brexit, many lies were told about the realities on the continent. And I would say, looking back, that was a mistake which should not be repeated. And so we can go through the different areas of values, and I would say the two encyclicals which Henning mentioned at the outset, namely Fratelli Tutti and Laudate Si, both of them, I would read them as a call to engagement. Of course, as an engagement on the church's values, but the church's values are shared by many, many people which have also political convictions. So I would read these also as a call to engage in democratic process, to make solidarity happen, to make sustainability happen. All this does not come about by doing nothing, and it also doesn't come about just, let's say, by going to church. It needs other types of engagement, namely the engagement in living democracy. And I think this is what we have to tell people, that democracy without people reacquiring this public space Tineke talked about does not function. So we need a new ethics of engagement, and we also have to then draw the consequences of this. What does it mean that if we want people to engage in democracy, what does this mean for other spheres of life? Well, I would say first, our life in terms of the productivity pressure has become so time intensive that many people don't have the energy anymore to go in the evening or over the weekend into one of the organizations and sustainably engage for their values. And I think we all together, all those who stand for values, whether the church or political parties or unions, we have to be critical of this, because humans are not just economic actors in terms of efficiency and productivity and raising profits. and being workers, they are also citizens, and they need to reacquire the space to go to church, to go to the union meeting, to go to a party meeting, if they want to. And as I said initially, I believe a good life should include and must include one of those collective activities. And all carriers of values suffer from the fact that the space for this type of activity has been crowded out by the pressures of the working life, which aims to optimize ever more the productivity of people. And this can be done in a way which is perfectly okay in terms of better work organization and so on. But one thing is also that all the movements to shorten the working time, to have humans have time for other things, have been stopped and reversed. And so I would say here is a common interest. And I very much like, therefore, to be very clear, that the churches stand for a Sunday which is free of work. Because this collective element of not working on a Sunday, it has huge implications for me. For example, I find it fantastic how the sound of the city changes. And an individual decision not to work on one day a week, you know, if we would just leave that to everybody's choice, would not lead to the result that the sound of the city becomes much more human in terms of much more silence being around. So I think it's great, for example, that the church engages on keeping the Sunday free of work wherever it can. And I would say in the same way, I think we have to also say that the engagement of unions to reduce working hours so that people have time for their family, but they also have time to politically engage, or for that matter, go to a church group in the evening or take care of their neighbors in an aging society, should also be welcomed. So I think there are many, many issues on which the carrier of values, unions, political parties, civil society and churches can stand together. So first we must acquire the time place, but second, and there I would join Tineke, we must both constrain these monopolistic digital powers which are now shaping both our individual use of the internet, but also the public space. But we also must re-empower new entrants and new initiative of the internet. So what is good, what is happening now, I think, is that in terms of legislation, the European Union is the only bloc in the world which tries to put in place legal rules which are binding and enforceable and carry democratic legitimacy to make sure that the private, very, very strong companies, in particular, of course, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, and Apple, all of which are among the top 7 of the American Stock Exchange. These are the most valuable companies in the world, with endless money in their pockets, that they learn to obey the rules which democracy set. This is the fight of our times, the primacy of democracy over technology and business interests. And I think the only continent where this works is Europe, because let's be clear, China is a dictatorship. If they set rules, these are rules which serve the power of the Communist Party. And in the United States, there is a failure of democracy in the sense that in Washington, in Congress, no laws are passed because of the situation of majorities, because of the American Constitution, which contains probably too many checks and balances, and because America is such a divided society, such a society where people really have a difficulty to agree on anything these days. And of course, last but not least, the overwhelming power of money in Washington. And I think it's very, very important that in European democracies, both domestic in every capital in Europe of the 27 member states, but also in Brussels, we make sure that money doesn't have this influence on politics as it has in America. So first, legislation is being put in place, and it's very complex legislation It's more than 8 different pieces of legislation, which maybe we can discuss more in L'Apparel. But this legislation constrains power, but also creates, hopefully, new opportunities for startups and for technology development in Europe. And this is, of course, very important. And I would say it's not only important for economic reasons and for reasons of digital sovereignty, it is also important for democracy, because democracy means choice. And an oligopolistic structure of the internet is a problem in the market, because it kills competition and it keeps out new entrants, and therefore kills creativity also in societies. But it also monopolizes opinion building. And so this legislation, which creates new possibilities to develop offers and choice, is important both for the market but also for democracy. And let me be concrete, just to mention one element. We are trying to make it possible that also European companies can get to the data which are right now completely monopolized by these 5 giants, and this data which is so necessary to develop good digital services and good artificial intelligence, for example. But yes, for sharing of data, and yes, for developing intermediaries in Europe which don't have the interest themselves to work with the data, but make the data available for the public interest purposes, which include also the work of startups. But of course, and there we come back to a point Tineke also mentioned, we must, of course, in doing all this in the data economy, also relearn that the great achievements of freedom over the last 150 years was that a king or a political party cannot get into our house and can control us in anything we do in our private life, like it was the ambition of the communists and the Nazis. The Nazis had one person on every block to inform about every family, every school child, what does this family do? They wanted to know it all. The great achievement was twofold. First, people have a private sphere, which is not something the state should be knowing about and directing. And I would say it is also a sphere which Google and Facebook and so on should not know about, and they should certainly not make profit from our private sphere and our private thinking. But that is today their business model. So that's one element. And the other element is that in the digital space, we must realize it has huge political implications. 50% of citizens in America and in Europe now build their political opinion on the internet. And they build their opinion on the basis of what the GAFAM, these 5 big companies, what they play up to them. And of course, they play up to them what is in their interest. The idea that technology is neutral is, of course, completely ludicrous. Whenever these companies build a technological system, they build it for their interest. And as Tineke rightly said, their interest is profitability first of all. So while Google, for example, claims that it has made accessible all the knowledge of the world to us and therefore is an actor of democracy, well, the reality is it entices us to use the search engine for free, and it's an attractive offer. And when we use the search engine, we are being searched. We are being sold off to advertisers with our dreams, our preferences, which they profile in the name of profit. So to conclude, I would join Tineke in saying that we must rebuild this space for free individuals, but we also must rebuild the space for democracy. And this is not only an issue of the internet. And I have not talked about now that the internet is the greatest time stealer in our lifetime, apart from the work pressure. we are entertaining ourselves to death, so to say, on the internet, and we must also learn to apply to ourselves a new discipline, not, let's say, to give too much space to the use of the internet for entertainment purposes, and then forget to do, let's say, the work, the free time work of the citizen, which is so necessary in democracy and which is so necessary to bring values to our life. I think I would like to conclude with this and look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Paul. Tremendous input for thoughts and in discussions. Professor Benanti, please, I don't want to guide your ideas and reactions with the initial question. So what is your thoughts? What are your thoughts about these inputs of Tineke and Paul until now? There are already questions from the public in the pipeline, so please wait still a couple of minutes until Professor Benanti has given us his thoughts about all these aspects.
Thank you for having me. I'm so glad to have this opportunity to dialogue with you all. Well, what is the perspective that someone that make of ethics of technologies, his expertise, could bring inside this kind of discussion? I think that the first stepping inside the discussion should be to open up what does it mean to talk about ethics of technology applied to this kind of technology and to the democracy and European Union. Well, to try to make it clear what I mean when I say ethics of technology, let me start from a huge book from the past that can give us the example that I need to introduce the topics. The book is, this one is a 1,000-page book that won a Pulitzer. It's one of the best, 100 best nonfiction books of all times. Is one of the Sunday Times bestseller. And it tells the story of one politician that simple shaped Manhattan in New York. The author is Robert Caro, and the man that is described inside the book is Robert Moses. Well, Robert Moses is that one that shaped Manhattan as we see today. One of the biggest things that Robert Moses did was the Parkway, a huge infrastructure with 6 lanes that is used to connect Manhattan to Long Island. Well, internet, AI, everything is an infrastructure. The life of Moses could help us to questioning technologies in an ethical way. Why? Because where everyone sees just asphalt and concrete, an ethicist sees something different. If we go deep inside the book, I can quote at least 25 passages in which Moses was clearly saying that his idea of developing the city was really political. Probably is a political idea that today will be not anymore acceptable, but at that time was really shared among politics. And the idea was that the best part of the city should be kept for the best part of the population. And in his opinion, the best part of population should be the white middle class. So to obtain this kind of partition of the city, what Moses did was really simple. He didn't realize any form of public transportation, any train, any fast transportation to go to Long Island. And he built the bridge, the concrete bridge, too tall to allow buses pass down the bridge. And so only people that own a car at the time, white middle class, was allowed to access to the bridge. So ethics of technology is questioning technology in one way. We are looking which kind of form of order technologies bring inside of society, which kind of displacement of power this kind of technology show inside society. And so if this is the technology, now it's not anymore a matter of streets, it's not just anymore a matter of asphalt and bridges, but probably the majority of you received a vaccination last year according to the order given by an algorithm through a web page. What the bridge did before, now software did inside society. And the new things, like Paul said and like Timneke underlined, is that this kind of instrument are deployed by subjects that are not public, by subject that could be for profit, by subject that produce a transferring of power inside the democratic society. Just to be still looking at the past, there is another huge infrastructure that was built at the early stage of the last century, the electricity power. Well, we have two models to distribute electricity inside the world. One model was that one that was made by Samuel Insull that lowered the price with GECO, General Electric Company, and democratized electricity, to use this United States term, distributing to the family with lower price. On the other hand, we have Lenin that in his first 5-year plan, Goelro plan, he would like to Sovietize the Russia through electrification. So there is not neutral infrastructure. I'm just replying to Paul, adding more elements to his discussion. There are no neutral technology. Every technology is a form of power. Every technology is a displacement of power. Well, and which kind of displacement of power is producing the displacement of such kind of digital technology that work with other subjectivity that we could firsthand define as AI algorithms? Well, if this is the question, let me try to underline some elements and then we can discuss a little bit much more later. The first one, it's a really philosophical one, and we could discuss on that a lot of time, but we have a crisis of normative ethics. The idea that we have to obey to some kind of norms is not anymore at least acceptable among Europeans. We struggle with the idea that we have to do something. You know, if you like to use a metaphorical with streets, just to remain near to Moses, we move our street from traffic lamp to randonnée, to the big round in the middle of intersection. So it's not anymore an external law that gives us the precedence, but is our self-adjusting regulation. And it happened actually with a really clear philosophical point, like, for example, Roland Barthes at the Collège de France in the mid-70s, when he said that language is fascist, not because do not allow us to say, but because it forces us to say in a determinate way. So in this idea in which we have to regulate ourselves, in which the society should allow us to regulate ourselves, we discover another way to shape or nudge the behavior of people. And this other way is the gamification, is the nudge theory. We give a Nobel Prize on economics about the nudge theory. So gamification, like a lot of examples in society, show has the same power of law. And they are much more acceptable by people because they are experienced like a teeny simple game, teeny simple activity with a reward. Just to give you an example, I will give you an Italian example, so no one will be offended by different country example. You know, we are really famous to be a little bit allergic to taxation. And there is a huge use of cash money that could be connected to not registered transaction. So the use of credit card, the use of digital payment could make taxation much more equal because you can trace every kind of taxation, every kind of transaction. But you know, people are not willingly to do that. You can write it so huge, like on a pack of a smoke. Smoke kill you, dark transaction kill the society, but people don't do it. Well, Italian government put a little price that is a cashback on digital transaction, and 10 million of Italians joined this kind of cashback, making every day more than 100 million of digital traced transaction. It's not a law, it's a gamification that works like a law. Well, in this environment, I give just some treat, should be much more detailed, but just to be synthetic. In this environment, in this milieu, algorithm is the perfect tool of gamification. Basically, we developed this tool to simply change the behavior of customers, online advertising and everything like that. And then we apply to social network and to social platform, and we discovered that this kind of tools with gamification can simply shape the behavior and the feeling of people. And it happens, and it has the same effect that of a law, like gamification has. And at this point, ethics of technology would like to underline a core concept that is connected to the justice. Justice as a virtue that is connected to the ethics. Well, the virtues of justice could be formulated or connected to the rule of law. Rule of law and legitimation is a way in which we can have a just form of power. Well, can we imagine a theory or an analysis that tell us if this kind of algorithm could be in tension with justice and rule of law? Well, if we see the formal constraint about rule of law that someone like Rawls suggests to have a justice in society, to have a legitimate power, Rawls suggests at least 5 of these formal constraints, and I would like to underline 3 of these 5 constraints. The first one is that law has to be knowledgeable. The second one is that law has to be universal. The third one is that law has to be general. What is the difference between universal and general? Rawls say that universal means they apply to everyone. If I wrote do not smoke apply to everyone. If I say general, it means that everyone could be the subject of the law. If I make a law that say that everyone has to obey to Professor Benanti, I like this law, well, the subject is just myself. Everyone has to obey is universal, but the subject is just myself. Like Paul Etinneke said before, we are used to have this check and balance system that say that the subject could be changed in a democratic way. Well, now apply the algorithm that simple act like a law, because they shape the behavior of people like a law would like to do, to this kind of formal constraint. Is an algorithm knowledgeable? Well, someone could say theoretically yes, with open source software. But a paper that won the Turing Prize in 1982 was entitled Trusting the Trust. You know, you never execute the code. You simply compile the code in an executable form that is machine readable and executable. Well, during the compilation, you can inject anything you want inside this kind of executable, and it make it dark, not visible, and it is not safe if it's not trusted inside the chain of trust. So algorithm, bottom line, are not transparent. Algorithm has a tension with the first formal constraint of rule of law. Are algorithms universal? The algorithm that we are talking, the algorithm that are driving AI in social space, they are profiling. And profilation is not universalization. Profilation means to split people among gender, races, among ethnicity, among census, and something else. And this is actually really different to be universal. Are algorithms general? Well, they obey just to the owner of the server. And because the owner of the server are company that are private, they are not under the check and balance regulation of a democratic system. So ethics of technology tell us that there is a transfer of power, that this kind of software artifact has a political dimension, that this kind of political dimension has a direct influence in how democratic system works, and ethics is a voice, and like every voice is shouting, please put your hand inside the box. Please make the box compatible with democratic institutions. I would like to close this kind of first intervention with the idea of consent. You know, we have Paul, one of the father of GDPR, and you know, consent and use of my data is one of the huge topic that we are interested in a customer side. Well, probably we have to rethink consent after the Me Too movement. I belong to an organization that probably has a lot to learn about the empowering of the other half of the gender of humanity, the empowering of women. But Me Too movement teach us something that is really important. Me Too told us that consent could not keep for granted one for all. It's a violence. If I don't ask you, are you willingly to do something with me? Well, the probably male powering model behind Silicon Valley development of technology has another kind of consent. They ask you once, do you consent, may click on consent, and then they do on your data what they want. Well, this model has to be rethinked, and probably we should move from this kind of consent to a new form of license in which I don't give any blind consent, but I simply give the license to make an operation on my data and stop. Like when I give a sort of consent in that form is the license that the doctor has to make a therapy on myself, not to do what he wants. You cannot do research on my body. Well, we allow these people to make research on my data. Well, it's not the same things, but we should think about that. I hope, like every ethicist, to have put more questions than give an answer for our debate, and I'm happy to hear how it will go.
But my wife is French, and I like the French roundabouts. So the example of the traffic light with the roundabout is just perfect. So Camille, what I would like you to do is now, let's say, in a very first reaction, a very first short reaction, to perhaps analyze a little bit from your perspective, one of the youngsters, what we should take out of the contributions for our next La Perelle. What should be on the agenda? What should be discussed in the different panel discussions? Give us just the feedback. Please really stick to what has been put on the table and give your analysis, how you see it and what you put out or would pull out of these proposals for taking with us to La Perelle at the 16th and to 18th of September. Please come in.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very happy to be here, and thanks for inviting me. I think that what's the most important here, and what I found in the papers, is that we have to, first of all, build some common home, resilience, dialogue, and build up community. And with that, I think I can agree with all the previous speakers, and I'm very, very happy that those things have been loudly said in such a manner that leaves no room for maneuvers, that we all understand that those things are needed. Yet, I think that there are some other elements that we should be addressing. And as every previous speaker spoke about social media platforms and how they operate, I can agree that there are many problems, including those algorithms, echo chambers, filter bubbles, and so on. But we have to remember that addressing just this is not sufficient, because when we think of our information space, we can see that there are some malign actors and evil forces that are trying to take advantage of our openness, trying to publish disinformation, misinformation, malinformation, and other information disorders. And we have to protect ourselves not only from too much power that some social media networks may hold, but mostly from enemies outside. And that being said, we need to think how to make our information space less polluted. And as here, we need to enforce it from social media platforms. It is, as I said, not sufficient. The EU is having a very interesting concept of resilience, meaning ability to operate, ability to reclaim the lost operationality and also to resist some external and internal pressure. And to do that, they advocate for something that I'm very sure will be very close to your hearts, whole of society approach, meaning that you have to have a dialogue and cooperation of all the society actors, meaning states, meaning think tanks and civil society, media, social media, churches, and many other entities that have to have their contributions in developing our capacity to defend ourselves and to flourish as democratic nations. NATO has something very similar, but it's a little bit more narrow. It's called whole of government. I think it will be nice to discuss both of these institutions, meaning whole of society and whole of government, perhaps also resilience, from the perspective of the social thought of the Catholic Church. And I got a feeling that we have been talking about those issues from a very high perspective, not only higher than policy, a bit more philosophical or strategic, if you allow. So what I suggest is also to include some practical elements, because sometimes it can be a bit ambiguous what the problem is and how does it affect us. For example, well, this is true that we have echo chambers and we're withdrawing from normal life to virtual life, but let's say from my personal perspective, I work in Turkey, I study in Spain, and I do a fellowship in Riga. So this is also a blessing. We have to know how to use technology to our advantage. And I think the speakers before have made a very fair point that, well, technology is not neutral, but we do have some pros out of it as well. And about this practicality, I think we should address things like clear information space that will be a good ground for dialogue and good ground to have real news, not just the pollution. So I suggest to add issues such as artificial content creation that is polluting our social media. Nobody mentioned that, I think, that malign actors are trying to use the already existing differences and polarizing issues to set us apart. Also that we are witnessing things like deepfake and cheapfake when it's not as certain what is happening, what we see, if it's really the thing that happened. For example, those artificially created videos that are doctored. And last but not least, I think that we should talk about encrypted channels and what happens there, meaning if you would like to address issues like terrorism, like people who want to harm us, and also people who are trying to control and manipulate our information space. They will may mostly not be on Facebook. They'll be somewhere else steering from outside. So in some cases, Facebook or Twitter will be helpless because things will be happening on Telegram and Signal and then steered on those platforms. I guess those issues are very important. So with that, I would like to close my short intervention, and I know that we don't have too much time. So thank you so much for having me here.
Kamil, I think the community building exercise appears in all the reflections. That is a pillar for us also, I think, Luciano. And before I put my questions to you all, Tineke, Paul and Paolo, please, Luciano, would you leave in Jamina with a question she has put, I think in the original tone, inviting her to express her question directly would be helpful for us. Please, Jamina, come in.
Hello, can you hear me?
Jamina, let's go for it.
Okay, thanks for giving me some time. Actually, I had two questions based on like recurring themes in the discussion. Firstly, to what extent can confusion be a good thing in democracy if it disrupts complacency and encourages critical discussion about what certain values mean instead of just like being a buzzword? And the second question, if there's time, is well, there was a lot of talk about advocating democratic values over economic gain and these kinds of things and having the courage. But how can Europe advocate these values without reinscribing some like old paternalistic or imperialistic power dynamics, which might have the result of kind of an anti-democratic backlash from some other countries who don't want to be treated like they're I guess, like students or pupils of Europe. So thanks for the time.
Thank you so much, Janina, for being brief and very good questions. I think, Paul, you being the representative here of the European Commission, please, would you come in this question about power dynamics and perhaps also about confusion? Is confusion good in democracy? Let's say, perhaps in the perspective of diversity in our societies, Paul?
Yes, I would say that diversity and freedom and the readiness to think yourself, that's definitely necessary, and criticism is of course necessary. So I would take issue a little bit with the let's say overstretching of the trust discourse. I mean, yes, there is a certain need for trust, but I think we should rather teach our children and continue teaching our school children to be critical of power, critical of public power, private power, power of organizations, but also power of technology, rather than to teach them trust. So I wouldn't want to say that confusion is good, although I would recognize that individual development of humans can go through confusion, and one can say, probably as a psychologist, it's good to be confused because it opens up thinking, and all this is fine. But I would say in a society, it's rather categories of criticism, tolerance, own thinking, which leads to a plurality of ideas, and I wouldn't call that confusion. I think we should aim to work towards clarity and understanding in democracy. That's my first answer. The other point on paternalistic, well, my view is that not everything is relative, and it is important that we say, sorry, if there's a country which does torture or which suppresses women, that's not okay. So I do not believe that geography or past imperialism and so on justifies just anything in terms of relativism. I think there are universal rights, there are universal truths, and we have to stand to them. And I think we should not admit that anything is relative and hey, these Europeans, here they come again. Well, let's work together on the basis of the United Nations Charter, the human rights catalog, and let's also work together on the basis of science. And let's not act as if everything can be put in question and there is nothing which has universal value or which has universal truth.
Thank you so much, Paul. Before I will go to other people who ask questions, let me, being critical, Paul, and let's say about, handling this confusion which we have in the title. So we had also at the last La Perelle a long, lengthy discussion about education. Tineke, you mentioned in the beginning that feeling that private has perhaps gained too much of an influence today compared to other times where the public was dominant. So this balance between your private life, your private incentives, your private preferences, and going out is confrontation. Being out in the streets is perhaps more difficult to handle in terms of emotions. So the whole discussion we had about regulating actors, regulating the markets, I think it comes pretty much back to the individual human being itself. So it needs to be disciplined. Father Benanti said about smoking, it's the same thing about these pictures on cigarettes. It's about being critical, as Paul said. So what would be your advice as a philosopher, having worked on Freud, having worked on Nietzsche? What is, let's say, is human being capital? Is human being capable to arrange these things for themselves, or are in these dynamics of today is it actually too much for the individual personality to handle these things? Education, parents and children comes in here, setting the framework conditions for a personality to evolve in that battle. So how would you see a philosophical perspective on that aspect?
Thank you. So much has been said, and so much I could also reply to. I think there's I don't think individuals can do it by themselves. I think human beings are first and foremost social beings. In that sense, they are connected already to others, and especially to young people. There is a very important role to play in authority. In authority, coming from the Latin augere, to increase, gives young people the opportunity to increase their capacities, and at the same time to develop themselves. So it's both getting input from the outside world and being capable of creating your own mature response. So I think that you need new ritualized ways of coming together and being together. And I think that might also be a very important topic to talk about. So how can you reconnect people, and how can you bring new rituals for coming together and for giving input to people? Maybe shortly also as a response to what Paul said, critical and distrust to me are not the same. I think it's one of the main confusions today, talking about confusions. When I talked about trust and de Tocqueville and the fact that you need to be trusting, it does not mean you do not have to be critical. It simply means that you do not morally judge the other as somebody untrustworthy. Yeah? Even if you disagree, even if you think there are blind spots, even if you think it needs to be corrected, I think exactly the fact that people associate being distrustful with being critical is actually one of the disasters of how people treat information. It's one of the reasons why also there's so many conspiracy theories. I distrust the elite, I distrust people who have power, therefore I'm critical. It's not being critical. Yeah. So I think it's very important also to clearly, in that sense, maybe also question what does it mean to be critical in an age where information is so overwhelming, and how can you develop strategies for learning people what it means to be critical as opposed to being distrustful. It's too easy to be distrustful, and so much of the bad and negative information and misinformation plays into the distrust. Because we are critical of the elite, what we say is true. No, that's not good enough. You really need a method for critical thinking. I think that when the question is what should be discussed, I think that's also a very important topic, maybe to talk about. So
Thank you so much, Ineke. I have Francesco waiting for the question. Luciano, would you leave in Francesco?
Thank you very much. Two questions. First of all, if you are satisfied with the Digital Service Act and the Digital Market Act, the way the debate is developing and the solutions that they are going to find. And second, don't you think we should regulate the metaverse?
Perhaps I would like to put that first to Professor Venanti, please. Perhaps with the suggestions you made, Professor Venanti, about using, let's say, artificial intelligence also to build us a bridge, using it as a tool and the capacity of regulating it. Would you answer this question, please?
Well, I get the second part about the metaverse. I lose the first part, but let's go deep inside the metaverse. Honestly, you know, I was one of the early adopter of Second Life, just for fun, and Second Life collapsed. So I'm not in a hype for the metaverse in that sense. But I could probably explain why Meta is pushing a metaverse. You know, there is a an economical law that simply say that from 2007, actually, the major cost of running a server station is not the price to acquire it, but the electrical power consumption. And if you consider that a social network publish tons of gigabytes of pictures, and the majority of those subjects are cat, food, and selfie, well, how could cat, food, and selfie pay back the cost of the electricity to store and share them? Well, this economical inquiry has a simple solution. My data, my time on platform is monetized by the company. And it happened in 2009 when Peter Thiel decided to push Facebook inside the stock market, making it a company for profit from a startup. And why he did that? There was a philosophical point that forced Peter Thiel in that kind of transformation. Peter Thiel was one of the best friends and one of the most passionate disciples, if you allow me to use this word, of René Girard, the French philosopher that teach the last time of his life in the United States. And René Girard has an interesting theory, social theory about competition and fight inside society. Well, Peter Thiel, when he financed and developed PayPal, he simply switched the role inside the company every month according to René Girard's suggestion to avoid any kind of competition. When he saw Facebook, he saw the perfect platform that was able to transform the Girard theory in practice. It was the perfect tool to fuel the human competition, to fuel debate, to fuel polarization. Well, Peter Thiel decided to monetize that kind of social tension. And every time that we fight on that, he make money from that. At one point, we start to cap the data, to ask a quota of the data. And now your phone asks you if you would like to allow the Facebook app to trace you. Well, to simply escaping from the trap, there is a simple solution: change device. Move from phone to a proprietary device like the Oculus Rift, in which all your data could be monetized. So we are looking at a different business model with different algorithm, and it's a totally new game. And we need a space of discussion before open up with green or red light to this kind of innovation.
Well, that is in my reading what Paul said, that the only values that will survive in that construct will be the market values, let's say, in approaching the human being from its bad side, from the polarization side, monetize on what we all carry in us, competition, and we have that let's say this tendency to fight still, right? And a couple of monopolists are able to monetize or to capitalize on this aspect of a human being. Is that correct, Paolo?
Yeah, it's correct, but I would like also to underline that in the case of Facebook, making Facebook something that is profitable on the market start from a clear philosophical point. It's strange. We could imagine that it's just technological, but it's a philosophy that became technology in that case, and it deserves to be deepened.
Paul, you came in on the chat. Would you respond to Madeleine's question, or shall we bring in Christian directly?
Yeah, we can have another question, but on the metaverse, the answer is yes, and we're doing it already, because all the rules we are passing now, of course, will apply to the metaverse.
Thank you so much. We have discussing now 90 minutes. Time has flown. It's incredible. And I would ask you, we are still 35 in the room. May I ask you to give us 5 minutes more and now invite, let's say, Christian Morelli and Madeleine coming into the room, please. Luciano, you give him access. Somebody, yeah, you, please be short. Please be short. We have 4 minutes to go to sum it up.
Right. So my question is, do we humans have the capacity, the competence to cope with digital public, with digital exposure, with showing ourselves outside of our private world in the internet, which is a public world? Or is this the wrong question? Should not we have the competence to deal with this, but should the companies be responsible for dealing with this? Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I would like to give that to you, Professor Benanti, because this similarity between machines and the human beings you have described also in your publications, is the human being, does the human being having that competence to handle this? Because this is really new, that we have machines, let's say, approaching our own characteristics very closely. Is that competence, can we let's say handle this competition and that fight with the artificial and the digital world?
Okay, the question is long, and the short answer is it depends on the way in which we use the machine, as always. Let's say that artificial intelligence is not the same things of human intelligence. It's really different. I don't go deeper because just these would like to go much more. Yeah. There is another things, how we works, and probably I quote at this point simple Daniel Kahneman, fast and slow thinking, in which our rationality has two levels. One really fast, that feel itself confident, that is 90% of time at work, and one that is more heavy, much more slow, and it's the most critical one, and usually we use it 10% of time. If you walk in some place with a friend, at one point you need to stop to continue to talk, you switch from system 1 to system 2. Well, what happened is that artificial intelligence could simple ignite your system 1. This is the danger, you know, make us confident with an answer that we expect to hear. And this interaction, this fast interaction, could allow us to simple delegate choice to the machine. But because machine is statistical, it has error, systematic error that could be biased, Short example, and I stop myself. If we take all the data, okay, of the election of United States president, from the first election nowadays, all the votes, perfect data, no error, all the data expressed, and we give to the perfect algorithm that could learn from that data everything. And then I ask to the algorithm, I'm making it a little bit anthropomorphic, but it's okay. Who will be the next president? You will tell me a man, 90% of certainty, then with 75% Caucasian, then with 65% between 55 and 65. Why not a woman? There are no women in the history, no women in data. But this is not something that is connected to the reality. There is a systematic error driven by data that are simple the picture or former choices. should we apply former choices to future choices? This is a philosophical question. This is a huge debate. This is philosophical, ethical, political debate, and we have to face it to use correctly this kind of machine.
As we had before to handle these machines before, the first locomotive engine was 15 kilometers. And I remember the first discussions about Walkmans. They were fearing that people and kids would lose reality in the streets. These were the first articles on Walkmans at the time. So as you said, Paolo, at one point you need to stop talking. I could continue for hours with you. I thank you so much for lively input into our agenda for the next La Perelle. Please join us there, 16th to 18th of September in Namur. We will work on, Luciano, we will work, and Marie, we will work on the agenda and the different panel discussions. I wish you a nice evening, and I send you a hearty thanks to all these inputs and the lively debate. The dialogue certainly created something new I did not know before. Thank you so much and enjoy your evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Camille.
Ciao,
Thank you so much.
Paolo, grazie.
Ciao, Luciano.
Ciao. Good evening.
Hai po.
See you soon in offline.
Bravissimi.
Grazie.
Ciao Francesco.
Ciao Luciano, ciao. Ci vediamo a Bruxelles.
Sì. Ciao Daniela. Enrico.
Grazie mille, ciao, è stato veramente interessante.
Grazie.
Grande.
Grazie. Thanks.
Ciao,
and
thank you. Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Give regards to Father Rotzik. If you see Father Rotzik.
Yes, it was in the meeting.
Oh, he was there.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much for preparing all this. I think it was very good that we have done it.